Welcome, playful spirits, to session 18 of the Sessions of Spirit. For the newcomers to this, you might be joining the cycle or the circle of reason in your particularity, which means you might not understand the rest of the sessions, but you can enter at any point and sort of rebuild. So I will go through the first 17 sessions in about 2 minutes, just to give you some context of how we got to where we are with the hardcore philosophers that are in the group still at this point. So Session 1, Hegel was the greatest philosopher because he summed up 3,000 years of philosophers. Session 2 is that for the last 200 years, nobody's understood Hegel because of one-sidedness. 3, once you grasp him, he empowers you to change the world. 4 is that you got to get past the stereotypes of totalitarianism, fascism, sexism, racism. That's the first negation. 5th session was about starting Hegel in his true beginning with the circle of reason. The 6th session was about how genuine philosophy is about the sublation of religion. At the end of the circle of reason, it's because of this session 7, universal logic, that we're going to put into analytic notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The 8th session is about how you start this universal logic with polemics, but that's just the first negation. The 9th session is that the truth is that it's the polemic of polemics, or sublation as genuine refutation. The 10th session was a masterclass in sublation called the Science of Logic that Hegel did. The 11th session is that the science of logic is way more profound. It's about the ineffable moving itself, the Tao moving itself. The 12th session was about how this universal logic has to be living in a freedom as the purpose of life. The 13th session was about liberating all of us together at the same time. The 14th session was about how we kind of have this inner relationship with our inner child, the totality of things. You can call it God, but session 15 is that you can call it just yourself and universal logic as an atheist. The session 15 was about how, or 16 was about how our gurus are just doing this sort of mystical science of logic. And the 7th session was about how we need to sublate old mysticism into genuine philosophy as sort of this amazing mysticism that is scientific. So that brings us to session 18 today. And I'll just go over the title. As you guys know, SOS stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls, whether you're religious or not, because philosophy needs to be practical, and we are trying to change the world and bring in a new world spirit. The title is How to Make Philosophy Fun Again, Benign-Violation Theory of Humor. Oh, and if you're just tuning in, all the notes for these sessions are free, and they are available in the descriptions to these videos. And they should always be free. So this is to kind of catch everybody up in this new world spirit, so we all have wisdom coming out of us. So the paragraph today goes like this. Philosophy seems to remain, after thousands of years, a still nebulous concept. But, as Aristotle tried to clarify, first philosophy in its purity seems to have to do with logic, dialectics, and argumentation. Is studying dialectics and logic supposed to be so boring? Hegel says no. Philosophy, even in its form during the 1800s, was dead and continues to be dead 200 years after his death. There is nothing more tedious than formal philosophy. One is immediately struck with boredom, Hegel says, at the sight of it. It is a lifeless, dead thing we drag with philosophy. Hegel's goal was to breathe life back into philosophy in all its forms and quicken the dead bones of logic at its core. This living reason is in all its mystery, grows and violates itself, but in the spirit of sublation giggles at itself from the distance of eternity. Let's get into the notes here. Let's unfold this bad boy. So I want to begin, guys, with a little bit of an exercise. I have a mystical kind of game to sort of test your spirits. And if you see here in the first point, I put a paragraph directly from Hegel that we talked about in a previous session. But the game is to find as many oppositions and as many contradictions in that paragraph that you can. And then if you can find the hidden unity, that is also a bonus of the game. Whoever finds the most contradictions in it wins. So this is the kind of game that we're always playing. By the end of this session, we'll talk more about what this actually looks like. But for now, if you want to take a quick glance at it, you can, or pause the video and try and find as many contradictions as I'm going through it. Then we'll sort of talk about at least how I interpret it and see who wins. But Hegel, even though he claims to breathe life into logic, he writes in such a way that it's not very fun. So I'm going to read through a paragraph just to give you a taste of what it's like to read these paragraphs without understanding the playfulness and the game and the mysticism and the funness and the dialectics behind it. So when you read these paragraphs from ordinary consciousness, 99% of people are going to have this painful experience. So these paragraphs I've taken from Hegel's first masterwork called The Phenomenology of Spirit, and it's coming from the last couple of paragraphs of the whole progression. It's in a section called Absolute Cognition, and Hegel is saying, this is the most amazing cognition. We all want this. But when you read it, you're like, what? Why? So paragraph 805, it goes, in this knowing then, spirit has concluded the movement in which it has shaped itself, insofar as this shaping was burdened with the difference of consciousness, i.e. of the latter from its object, a difference now overcome. Spirit has won the pure element of its existence, the notion. So what is he saying here? This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? Well, what he's actually saying is that spirit at this end state has done something profound. Consciousness is a stage of this spirit. It's earlier, and it's where there's a separation between the thinking subject and the object. They are not the same. So the thinking subject is thinking about the object as its limit. And if you can't overcome your limit, you can't integrate it into yourself. That is the limit of your reasoning. You're not free from this object. It conditions your freedom. The notion is this pure element. It's in the science of logic. Hegel says it's the hardest thing to grasp. But he says once the notion overcomes this opposition between the subject and the object and welds them into one, you get this thing called the notion. And I put a little bit of a quote there to help the scholars realize how I realized this by reading different sections of Hegel's encyclopedia. But we're talking about the notion here, not just in a subjective form. Hegel is directly saying that this is what we are. This is the logic that not just our thinking, but our being is actually doing. And so the notion is about sublating this opposition that we take for granted and that we don't ever think we can get rid of. But the rest of the paragraph kind of says, well, you do this in a strange way to attain absolute cognition. He says the content, in accordance with the freedom of its being, is the self-alienating self, or the immediate unity of self-knowledge. That sounds contradictory. What's he even saying here? Well, what he's saying is once you start thinking in this notional way, the thing that is your content, the thing that you're thinking about is your own self-alienation. The object is your own doing in some way, but it's in your own freedom that you're doing that. But then in this end state of spirit, where it's sublating this distinction, it's a return back into yourself. So you self-alienate yourself into what you're not to bring it back into yourself. And when you return into yourself, this is what Hegel calls immediate, because the thing that's other to you is the mediating element. It's what's not you to know there's something that's not you, right? But then when you put that back into yourself, it's like you going back into yourself. So there's an immediateness because you're already there. You're already at where you're going to. Okay, so it sounds pretty contradictory, but that's kind of the true nature of the notion and reality when you grasp it beyond this abstraction between you and the outside world. The pure movement of this alienation, considered in connection with the content, constitutes the necessity of the content. The distinct content as determinate is in relation, is not in itself. It is its own restless process of superseding itself, or negatively. Therefore, negativity or diversity, like free being, is also the self, and in this self-like form in which existence is immediately thought, the content is the notion. So he's just explaining what I just said there. This kind of opposition keeps you going forever. The notion is the constant integration. Spirit, therefore, having won the notion, displays its existence and movement in this ether of its life and is science. In this, the moments of its movement no longer exhibit themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, but since consciousness's difference has returned into the self as specific notions and as their organic self-grounding movement. So what he's saying that as you overcome the limit of the object, your consciousness, the way you think and the way you are in the world changes your whole state changes into a different shape of consciousness. And you're just evolving. And we've seen this sort of in the science of logic. The pure categories themselves think themselves into their next stages, but we also do that in sensuous reality as finite creatures. And then we kind of circle back on ourselves, like remember the circle of reason, and then we ground ourselves. We are the beginning and the end of ourselves when you're in this absolute cognition. You see the full circle of this universal reason. Whereas in the phenomenology of spirit, each moment is the difference of knowledge and truth, and is the movement in which that difference is canceled. So the phenomenology here is this movement, this moment between the subject knowing that it has an object outside of it. This is where the phenomenology of spirit begins, but it's not the true beginning. The true beginning is the science of logic, right? But he's saying that there's a difference in phenomenology between what our knowledge is and what the truth is. You only grasp the truth when the thing that's outside of you comes into yourself in its notional form, in that pure logic. So phenomenology is inherently always oppositional, right? If you don't have an opposition between you and the object, then you're sort of returning to the state of immediacy. So phenomenology, that's why phenomenology is the second moment of subjectivity, because it's the moment of difference. And we know in the universal logic, in the three moments of logic, the second moment is always the moment of opposition. So that's why he's putting the word phenomenology here, is that he's saying as spirit moves through this world of appearances, it has this object that it's going to cancel in its movement to get to the truth. And the truth is just itself. That's why it returns to itself. When you do this in truth, it's what science is. When you see things in their difference, but also in their unity, where their limit is canceled, this is what truth is. On the contrary, since the moment has the form of the notion, it unites the objective form of truth and of the knowing self in an immediate unity. So he's saying it's not just our thinking, our act, like the entirety of ourselves in our objectivity goes through this movement of the notion. The moment does not appear as this movement of passing back and forth from consciousness or picture thinking into self-consciousness. So remember, when Hegel says you don't grasp the universal logic, you're trapped in this phenomenology that's picture thinking. It's this finite thinking, which is fragmented and painful. It's not pleasant. It's not playful. So when you attain true self-consciousness, you have this reflection on the opposition that unites it. And when you're in this unity of thinking, all these oppositions you can ideally mediate, and they don't fix you. They don't ossify your spirit. You're free. But this is a universal self-consciousness that he's talking about. And this is what the section absolute cognition is saying it looks like at the end here. On the contrary, its pure shape, freed from its appearance in consciousness, the pure notion and its onward movement depends solely on its pure determinateness. So he's saying that this outwardness is where appearances happen, and appearances aren't the real truth, right? They can be an illusion. So he's just saying that there's an inner necessity to things, which is what this determinateness is. It's the thing that's separating things, but in its internal dynamic is actually a relation. It's connecting them all in this sort of scientific necessity. This revelation is therefore the rising up of its depth or its extension, the negativity of this withdrawn I, a negativity which is its externalization or its substance. And this revelation is also the notion's time. So maybe I'll let you read the rest of this. This is the very end paragraph now of this absolute knowing, this absolute cognition. And he's saying this thing called notions time, which is weird. When you grasp how to think in notions, you stop this picture thinking of fragmentation. Your thinking becomes incredibly fluid. There's like nothing that can stop it. And this infinite power of thought flows through you. It's like incredible. And it's so incredible that your sense of time itself changes. So the pure notion, it operates in its pure logical form in the science of logic, okay? But the science of logic is a timeless, spaceless place. It's super sensuous. But you can access this because you're a repetition of the logic, of the notion as an I. So you thinking about yourself, you are the notion, but you're seeing a tiny little sliver of yourself in it. You're not getting this absolute cognition. You're still in picture thinking, but you are this pure vitality trying to break out. And when you do that, you experience a tremendous shifting in the way you experience reality. It in fact starts to have this eternity to it, what Spinoza was calling the subspecies aeternatus. Aeternatus. Uh, so Hegel's saying this is where you want to end up. And this is sort of like this absolute knowing itself. And that these spirits that it's talking about here at the end of the paragraph, I put another quote here to kind of help you realize there's a parallelism happening with the science of logic, that the spirits are just the pure godlike categories of the science of logic. They're coming through in two different places. So what Hegel's really saying here at the end, that's baffled philosophers for 200 years, is that he's really just talking about finite consciousness as spirit returning to the science of logic. So we're seeing a return here, and it's really counterintuitive if you don't grasp the circle of reason. So the spirits and the pure logical categories are the same thing in two different forms. One's a sensuous form, and the other one's back in the science of logic. And so this is the cavalry. This is the kind of painful kind of progress in history that we're seeing. We're doing it in our phenomenology, in our minds. The science of logic is doing it purely in itself, as pure thought thinking itself. And history is just doing the same thing. It's working out the categories in linear time. So you're getting like three different types of the same logic working itself out. And Hegel is saying at the end of the phenomenology of spirit, he's just showing what it looks like to the pure eye when it realizes this. That's what we're doing. So if you grasp this, this is where the playfulness begins. This is how you make philosophy fun again. But when you read that paragraph without me explaining it to you like that, it's torture. It's actually torture, because the words that you're using to parse it are not actually connected in their determinateness, in that inner necessity. In some way as a child, you just memorized them, and they have enough meaning that you can stitch them together. So you have this like fragmented, jittery thinking that's really painful. But once you grasp this living logic underneath, you can read it way more fluidly, and it's so profoundly clear. It'll be almost like addictive to you in a way. It's calling out the spirit in you. It's calling out your absolute cognition that is waiting to be born and made explicit. So until that happens to you, it took me like 3,000 hours. I don't think we need to do that for everybody. You do have to put the work in, but I created a document called the Spirit Mission, which is a more modern way of going through what he's saying. But you can never really substitute what he's saying, because the way he's using the words really helps you get that vitality. But the Spirit Mission is a little more fun, and it actually talks about how fun gets created. In the Spirit Mission, I actually build up to it. There's this concept of psychological safety that Google is studying in their teams. So when we're having fun with other people, you're technically in a team dynamic, and you're working out how to play, basically. But without psychological safety, Google found out, you can't have high performance. It's not fun. It's drudgery. It's often not very rewarding. So you have to create a sort of psychological safety, and that only comes when your reason starts to become fluid. And when you see other people as opposite to you, you immediately self-recognize with them and bring them back into the fold of who you are. So you can move with them as if they're you, right? As you're, what do they say with introverts? You're alone together. The I that is we and the we that is I, Hegel says in some other ways. If we're going to do peaceful revolution and kind of make it fun and not just like scary sort of how revolutions in the past usually go violently, if we want to get over that, we have to grasp what play is. And in order to do that, you have to grasp this ideal phenomenological state. We are these finite creatures, so we have to deal with phenomenology. And when you start getting this notional thinking, you get that what we covered in the previous session about Eckhart Tolle and presence and all this. It's like a timelessness, because the realm of the science of logic is timeless. So you're just realigning that mystical alignment factor, just realigning with that universal logic in yourself. So I go through that a little bit, talk about what freedom is again. We covered that in previous sessions. This is what love is. It's just sublation, self-actualization. It's the purpose of life. We covered that before too. People say, I want sex, money, power. No, all those things are just serving one ultimate goal, which is the liberation of your spirit into this absolute cognition, this absolute fluidity of your thinking with yourself in the other, in the world, in your phenomenology. Any projects we do, whether it's Spirit, WEWA, the Worldwide Essential Workers app, or CRISPR Labs, you want to have this sort of this fluidity and this playfulness. And this is kind of what spirit is, but it's not just a blissed out happiness. It's this meaningful happiness which contains the negation. So we're not running away from negations or challenge. We're actually going into it. Okay, so don't mistake what I'm saying in this playfulness as not actually dealing with the real content. We actually have to do real work. It just doesn't have to be a drudgery. So this is what meaning is. This is meaningful happiness. We're actually doing real things. But how do we create this state? We've been talking about this for 17 sessions. Let's get into the determinate details. Let's not leave it indeterminate and, try and figure it out kind of like hippies did. They had the right spirit. They just couldn't talk about it, Just vibe, man. Just feel it. Well, we don't have to do just that. There's people who can, but it's a privilege to do that. Not everybody can do that. So we're going to give them some tools. And the tools are to help you get into this notional thinking, which in modern parlance, modern lingo is what we call flow state. And so flow has been the sort of pop psychology category for a long time because it's sort of sensationalized and it's sexy and it's, mystics and new age kind of jump on board with it, or, performance coach, life coaches and stuff like that. But there is real science to it. And this guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, he was the first to study flow states in this more determinate way by looking at World War II soldiers who were in concentration camps. And he said, well, some soldiers survived that terrible scarcity and a lot of them died. So what was the difference between them? And he said the difference was flow state, this sort of implicit notional thinking. Some people are just born with it. But we want, it's actually in everybody's spirit, right? That's why everybody's infinitely valuable in this peaceful revolution, this new world spirit that we're making. But we have to make it explicit. And these soldiers were just naturally doing it. And it was giving them this inner vitality. Remember, it's bringing this infinite power of thought into the sensuous world. And that's the power of vitality. You can survive a concentration camp on this kind of pure thought power. So what they were actually doing, though, Mihai figured out, was that they were using artificial mechanisms. And these artificial mechanisms to create flow state is what he called games. So yes, in ordinary thinking, this is what games are. Games are creating this absolute cognition in little fragments. But there's specific qualities you have to satisfy to have these types of flow games. You can have good games or bad games. So here's the criterion of how to identify when you have a good game. The first scientific criterion that he identified was that, one, you always experience a sense of timelessness, a timeless presence with the game. Time just flies by when you're having fun, right? The second thing is you are completely immersed. The sense of self that you have inside of yourself is blending and merging with the sense of yourself outside of yourself. It's what we just read in that painful paragraph we read of Hegel. He was just describing the logic of it, right? But it's really just complete immersion in the moment. And then the third criterion is intrinsic enjoyment. When you get yourself into this movement with the world, whatever you're doing becomes a part of you and you become a part of it. Your doing and your being become one, and it's intrinsically enjoyable because it's this liberation of the essence of who you are. It's what you really want, and it's the purpose of life, to have this freedom in your thinking and being. So these are the criterion that Mihai identified, but he didn't have the universal logical explanation of it. Only Hegel, in my opinion, has this sort of explanation. So even with these three things and games, they're not always correlated. So you can have a game that does not relate. The laughs will come tomorrow, okay? Remember, today is just about how to have fun. We're explaining how the frog works. So you can have a game, but it doesn't always result in timeless presence, complete immersion, intrinsic enjoyment. That's because there's a difference between good games and bad games. Good games are cooperative, healthy competition versus bad games, which are adversarial competition, or they don't engage you properly. They're like adversarial against your dialectics inside of yourself. They don't align with you. The third thing is that you can create these flow states with these artificial external mechanisms, Other people can create games for you, like escape rooms, stuff like that, and they can put you into flow from the outside in. But you can also create flow states from the inside out. And Mihai he discovered that certain personalities create these states automatically, and he gave them a name called autotelic personalities. So if you have an autotelic personality, which is a self goal, you create your own direction, your own purpose, almost like your own teleology. People that are really good at this create these types of good games. So I gave you in the first point here some ways to recognize timelessness, presence. We're breaking out of the bad infinite, the genuine infinite that Hegel talks about. I put it into a little bit more of his logic. But really it's just repeating the logic of the notion. What you need to know about the notion is that it is instantly self-differentiating. So it takes itself and turns it into what it thinks it's not. But what it's not is actually just itself, right? So then it gets a spontaneous and instantaneous sublation of itself back into itself. So it's this instantaneous, like back and forth between negation and sublation. That's what the notion is. And it's this kind of creative process. It needs nothing outside of itself. It just keeps doing this like an engine. It's like the pure engine of thought. So the second category, or the second principle of creating flow states with games, is this distinction between good competition and bad competition. So I won't go through it all because we're running out of time. But there's this naive notion that in order to have playfulness, you have to get rid of competition itself. And this is a naive mistake. This is like trying to throw out negation. It's like trying to get rid of abstract negation because it's the moment of separation and you just want to do sublation. But that's naive because sublation is built upon negation. You can't have it in its abstract form. Negation is just, or sublation is just the negation of negation. So it goes with competition too. If you don't have competition, you can't really interact with the other person in terms of the 4 criterions of a good game. So if you go to the bottom of this paragraph, Mihai was gracious enough to tell us, okay, there's actually more specific rules to creating good games that have proper competition that doesn't fall into this adversarial competition, which often involves cheating, things like this. So he says to have a good game, you need at least 4 things always. So a good game that creates flow states, 1, must have clear goals. Number 2, must have clear and immediate feedback. Number 3, it must have a good balance between the perceived challenge level of the game and the player's perceived skill level. And then 4, you have to have clear rules. If you notice the trend between those 4 points, it has clarity in each of them. Remember, philosophy, true philosophical thinking, is about thinking clearly. So these are philosophical principles on the dialectics that pertain to these games. So if you don't have these things clear, you're going to get the cheating, you're going to get misunderstanding, you're going to get a whole bunch of things that don't create this fluidity of a good game that mimics the logic of the notion inside of you and brings out the flow state. You don't get timelessness, you don't get complete immersion, you don't get intrinsic enjoyment. So when we create games, with any projects we work on, we're actually aiming for these 4 things right away. We're going to have check boxes and make sure that these things are in place. We know that the goal of any game is just liberation of spirit. So we're going to define that like Hegel does. The second thing, having immediate feedback. This is where apps come in our phones. So one of the limitations of the past that Mihai had is he had these like surveys that he would get people to fill out every couple of hours in the day to check their state. Well, it was so tedious, it would disrupt the state. But now that we have phones, as long as people trust the phones and trust us and trust the spirit that we're trying to protect them, then we can give them that immediate feedback like any other app. It's amazing. And then we can measure their dialectics to see what their challenge level of a job is and what their skill level is through these databases. And then we can kind of like make sure people aren't skirting the rules by clarifying them, but also letting people challenge them at all times. So this is the external way to create games. You need to do these 4 things. It's a science. You can make flow state a science because it is a science, as Hegel says. So that's the outer. So the last point is the inner. So he says, yep, you can create those games. That's what we're going to do in this new world spirit. We will be helping people improve their lives by coordinating their 11 life areas and having a comprehensive economic and political process worldwide, globally, through these apps. through the peaceful revolution. But we're also going to be teaching people through these courses how to do it for themselves. So there's a personality type that he also defines more determinately with these principles here, or with these personality traits. So somebody with an autotelic personality, one, has internal locus of control, which means that they have power in themselves. They take responsibility for whatever's happening to a certain degree that empowers them to sublate things. They're not waiting for something outside of them to sublate. They, through their own wisdom, their own philosophical consciousness, can sublate almost any opposition because the notion is who they are. Number two, they have curiosity. Curiosity is this openness of mind. Once you trust the dialectical process and speculative thinking, it frees you, right? You're no longer having enemies all around you. They start becoming your friends because you start seeing them as universal logic that you can flow with and reason with. Three, it gives you this incredible vitality, this perseverance emotionally to tarry with the dialectic because you know, and you have the faith that the rational is real and the real is rational, right? We talked about that in previous sessions. Four, you have low self-centeredness, because you're merging with yourself in the world. You're recognizing that your small self isn't all there is. You have a greater, higher self that allows you to connect with other people and other things and bring their ideal potential out. And five is intrinsic enjoyment of the moment. You just start enjoying your life because everywhere you go is ideal. So the last part of this, I just want to return to that game we did. And here's the answer in point number 4. Here's all the contradictions and oppositions I could find. Maybe you can beat me, but I think I got 11 in there. So the colors are just highlighting the oppositions. And if you see the comments that I made, I explain why I think these are in the modes that they are. And if you can identify the hidden unity, tomorrow that's where we're going to pick up, because humor is intrinsically connected to overcoming this moment of opposition in what's called the benign-violation theory of humor, and then you sublate it. But it's like a climax. So I'm going to end that here today. Join me for a discussion here in the chat. And if you want to join the movement, we have to know where your wisdom is so we can start playing with you, start bringing the wisdom out of you and sublating. So there's a wisdom quiz there. Feel to jump in, and we will engage with you into this new philosophy of intrinsic enjoyment, timelessness, and complete immersion. Stay mystical, keep sublating.